On a humid night in early July 1834, lightning danced over the hills of Wolfe County, Kentucky, as Mary Delaney, a midwife's daughter herself, gave birth to identical twin boys. Their arrival came during a thunderstorm so intense that the wind tore shingles from rooftops and horses refused to settle. She named them Ezra and Elijah, two perfectly healthy, pink-faced boys with matching dimples and coal-black curls. The family, poor but proud, saw the twins as a divine blessing. The Delaneys were farmers, rooted in old Appalachian beliefs, some Christian, some far older and darker. The midwife whispered something under her breath that night, a prayer or perhaps a warning, before handing both babies over to their exhausted mother. For the first few years, everything seemed ordinary. The boys grew as brothers often do, inseparable, mischievous, always speaking in unison or finishing each other's thoughts. They shared a crib, shared toys, and later shared a bed in the small cabin's loft. Even the family dog, a mutt named Jude, couldn't tell them apart. But shortly after their third birthday, things began to change. First, it was small things. Elijah began speaking to people who weren't there. Ezra would wake up screaming, saying he saw someone standing in the corner. Their father, Thomas Delaney, a hardened man not known for fear, started sleeping with a Bible under his pillow. He said he heard whispering at night, like two voices overlapping, one boy asleep, the other awake. Then came the animals. The Delaneys kept chickens, goats, and a workhorse, all of whom began refusing to approach the boys' bedroom window. The goats bleated wildly at dusk. The chickens stopped laying. Even Jude, the family's loyal dog, began sleeping outdoors and refused to come near the twins after sunset. One morning, Mary found a dead crow nailed to their doorframe, its wings outstretched like a crucifix. No one in the family claimed responsibility. No neighbors confessed. In fact, no one wanted to talk about it. But it was Elijah who changed the most. He became withdrawn, solemn. He began reciting phrases he shouldn't have known, biblical passages, Latin verses, and strange riddles that no one had taught him. Once, he drew a picture in the dirt of a man buried in a box, surrounded by trees with eyes. Then, on a cold night in late September, Mary went to check on the boys and found Elijah lifeless in bed. No wounds, no sickness, no struggle, just a pale face, his tiny hands folded over his chest, and a faint expression of peace, or something like it. The doctor from the next county arrived 2 days later and could find no cause of death. A seizure, perhaps, he mumbled, though no signs pointed to it. The boy simply stopped. The town grieved. So did the Delaneys, at least most of them, because Ezra had changed. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't speak. When the small wooden coffin was lowered into the earth behind the cabin, Ezra stood silently, watching with wide, unreadable eyes. That night, he sat by the fireplace and whispered something under his breath that made Mary drop her needlework. He's not all the way gone. In the days that followed, Ezra refused to respond to his name. He would answer only when called Elijah. He began sleepwalking, always heading in the direction of his twins' grave. More than once, they found him outside at dawn, barefoot, shivering, and muttering. He talks to me when I'm dreaming. Then came the crescent mark, a faint red shape on Ezra's chest, in the exact spot where Elijah had once had a birthmark, and where Mary remembered touching her lips during the funeral. It was as if something had shifted, like the line between the brothers hadn't been broken, just twisted. The Delaneys weren't educated folk, but they were superstitious. The neighbors began whispering. The wrong twin had died. Or worse, the dead one came back. But no one dared say it aloud, because deep in the Appalachian woods, you didn't speak of such things. You didn't question the order of life and death. And you certainly didn't ask which child you were tucking into bed at night. Elijah was gone, but Ezra wouldn't let him rest. The morning after Elijah's funeral, the sky hung low with gray clouds, and a strange, still silence filled the Delaney homestead. Ezra hadn't spoken a word in nearly 48 hours. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't cry, wouldn't move unless prompted. He simply sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, staring into the embers like he was listening to something no one else could hear. At first, Mary and Thomas Delaney chalked it up to grief. After all, the two boys had never spent a single night apart in their lives. Losing a twin, that kind of pain doesn't heal easily. But then came the first truly disturbing sign. That night, around 2 a.m., Mary woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. She lit a lamp and found Ezra missing from his bed. Panic seized her heart. She and Thomas grabbed lanterns and ran barefoot across the dewy grass, calling Ezra's name into the darkness. They found him 30 minutes later, lying on top of Elijah's grave, motionless. His nightgown was soaked with morning dew, and his hands were bleeding, fingernails chipped, knuckles raw. He had tried to dig into the soil. When they brought him back inside, Ezra didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just whispered, "He's not comfortable down there." Mary clutched her son and began to weep. Thomas, shaken to his core, nailed the front door shut every night after that. But that was only the beginning. Ezra began talking in his sleep, except it wasn't his voice. It was Elijah's. The family had home remedies for sleepwalking and restlessness. Herbs, poultices, whispered prayers from the old world. But nothing worked. Every night, Ezra would murmur things like, "It's dark down here. You buried me too early. Why did you switch us?" Mary started keeping a journal, terrified that something was wrong, not with Ezra's mind, but with his soul. She recorded every incident. The dirt under his nails in the morning, the strange drawings of caskets and roots and eyes, and the chilling fact that Ezra now wrote with his left hand, Elijah's dominant side. One day, Mary caught him speaking to someone in the mirror. He wasn't playing. He wasn't imagining. He stood completely still and whispered, "It's not fair that you're the one in the dark." When she asked who he was talking to, Ezra turned slowly and said, "He wants me to visit again. He's lonely." By now, the townspeople had started to notice. At church, Ezra refused to say his name aloud. During Sunday school, he corrected the pastor on obscure Bible passages he shouldn't have known. Even the local reverend admitted he felt cold when Ezra passed by. The neighbors whispered. One woman swore she saw two boys, not one, running through the woods at twilight. Another claimed that when she passed the Delaney house, she heard laughter from the loft window. Two voices. Identical. But only one child lived there. Thomas, increasingly on edge, started drinking more. He avoided coming home early and refused to speak the grave. Mary tried to comfort her remaining child, but even she was beginning to wonder. Was it truly Ezra who had survived? The family's dog, Jude, once fiercely protective of the boys, now growled at Ezra whenever he got too close. One night, the dog refused to enter the cabin altogether. He stood at the edge of the porch, whimpering, staring up at Ezra with a look of pure confusion, as if he didn't recognize him anymore. Then came the moment Mary could no longer ignore. She was preparing supper when Ezra came up behind her and tugged on her apron. He hadn't spoken in days. She turned, kneeling to meet his eyes. His face was blank. "I told you," he whispered. "I'm Elijah. Ezra's in the ground." She dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered across the wooden floor. Ezra, or Elijah, walked away calmly, humming the lullaby Mary had sung to them as infants. The one only Ezra had liked. That night, Mary didn't sleep. She sat up in the boy's empty bed, staring out the window toward the grave behind the house, wondering if somehow, in some unspeakable way, the wrong child had been buried. Or worse, if Elijah had come back. By now, Mary Delaney didn't know what scared her more, what Ezra was saying, or what he refused to say. The once lively boy she had raised was nearly silent, except for strange mutterings at night or sentences spoken in a voice that didn't sound like his own. He no longer responded to Ezra, and if someone called him that, he would look up slowly, coldly, and whisper, "That's not me." But then something happened that changed everything. One bitter morning in late October, Mary was gathering laundry from under the bed when her hand brushed a small leather-bound book. She pulled it out, expecting it to be one of Ezra's old sketchbooks. But the first page made her freeze. "For when I forget who I am." It was written in a shaky, childlike scrawl, but the words that followed were anything but childish. Page after page was filled with drawings, phrases, and descriptions that no child could have known. There were images of a boy buried underground, his mouth stitched shut. Sketches of two identical children, one reaching down into a hole, the other reaching up. There were tall trees with eyes in the branches, and graves drawn over and over again, each with a single word scratched into the dirt beneath. Trade. The final pages were worse. They contained phrases that sent chills down Mary's spine. He asked me to open the door. When I sleep, he takes over. Mother doesn't know who I am anymore. I buried my name. Mary slammed the journal shut, breathless. She showed it to Thomas that night, hoping it would finally convince him that something was truly wrong. But Thomas barely looked at it. He tossed it into the fireplace and told Mary she was feeding the boys confusion, that she needed to let go of Elijah and focus on the son they still had. But Mary couldn't. Not after what she had read, and not after what she heard the next night. She was walking past Ezra's room when she stopped because she heard two voices inside. She pressed her ear to the door. One voice was Ezra's, soft, high-pitched. The other was lower, scratchy, like it was crawling up from inside the earth. She burst in. Ezra was alone, sitting cross-legged on the floor, smiling. When Mary asked him who he was talking to, he simply pointed to the wall and said, "He doesn't like you listening." That same week, strange things began happening around the house. Mirrors would fog up and reveal faint handprints. Furniture was found moved from where it had been placed. Knives disappeared from drawers and reappeared in Ezra's toy chest. Mary would wake in the middle of the night to hear scratching beneath the floorboards, and sometimes a knocking that came in threes. Then one evening, while cleaning the attic, she found something even worse. A second journal. It was older, thicker, and written in a completely different hand. But it wasn't hers or Thomas's. The handwriting was eerily familiar. It matched the scribbles she remembered Elijah making in church programs before he died. The journal detailed dreams. Dreams of suffocating, of dirt falling into a mouth, of screaming with no air. It talked about a brother who stole my breath and a mother who forgot my face. One passage read, "If I stay quiet, he lives. But if I scream loud enough, maybe she'll come dig me up." Mary sat in the attic, numb, journal in hand, the daylight fading around her. She began to wonder, did Elijah ever truly die? Or had Ezra, in some impossible way, switched places with him? Then came the story that broke her. An old woman from the edge of town, a recluse who practiced Appalachian folk medicine, came to visit Mary after hearing whispers in church. She brought with her an old wooden pendant and a warning. Sometimes twins ain't just born. Sometimes one takes too much. Breath, light, soul. That's how it begins. And if one crosses over too soon, the other becomes a doorway. Mary tried to dismiss it, but she couldn't unsee what was happening to her son, or unhear the voice that no longer sounded like his. Ezra's skin had grown pale, as if something inside him was fading. He barely ate. He barely blinked. And at times, Mary would swear she saw his shadow move in the wrong direction, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The boy she once knew was slipping further away. And every time she tried to hold on, he would simply whisper, "You buried the wrong one." Sometimes the only way to silence a nightmare is to dig it up. By the time the frost of early December crept in, Mary Delaney no longer recognized her own child. Ezra, if that was still his name, had become a ghost within the home. He no longer laughed, no longer asked for stories, or clung to her dress hem like he once had. He spent hours staring out the window toward the trees that bordered Elijah's grave. Sometimes he would smile faintly, like he was remembering something, or someone. But the final straw came on a night when Mary found him once again outside, barefoot in the snow, standing at the foot of his twin's grave with a shovel. When she tried to take it from him, he whispered, "He's waiting. I told him we'd switch back tonight." Mary dropped the shovel in shock. She could no longer deny it. Something unnatural was happening. The next morning, she made a decision most mothers could never imagine. She would exhume her son's grave. Against Thomas's furious objections, she sent for Reverend Harlan and a neighbor named Elias Coates, a level-headed carpenter known for keeping calm in crisis. They gathered in the freezing gray light of morning, standing silently at the small wooden cross that marked Elijah's resting place. Mary clutched a pendant of St. Michael in one hand and the burned edge of Ezra's journal in the other. The men dug in silence. The dirt was frozen, heavy, but soon the dull thunk of spade hitting would broke the still air. Thomas refused to come closer, choosing instead to stay on the porch, arms crossed, eyes full of silent fury and fear. When they finally lifted the coffin out and pried it open, Reverend Harlan gasped and crossed himself. Because something was wrong. Very wrong. Elijah's body was inside, yes. But he wasn't positioned the way they had left him. His arms, which had been folded neatly over his chest at burial, were now splayed out as if clawing upward. His fingernails were torn, blackened with dirt. His mouth, once closed, was open in a silent scream, frozen in terror. But what chilled them to the bone wasn't the posture, it was the freshness. His skin had not decayed like it should have after months underground. There was no rot, no smell, no insects, only the faint, cold pallor of someone recently passed. Reverend Harlan whispered, "This boy was not dead when we buried him." Mary fell to her knees. Elias Coates dropped his lantern. They resealed the coffin, but word spread quickly. Neighbors came to see the grave. Rumors twisted faster than the wind. Some said Elijah had been possessed. Others claimed Ezra had somehow swapped places with his twin, spiritually or otherwise. The old woman from the edge of town returned and murmured that a door was opened, and now both are stuck halfway through. But the most terrifying development happened that night. Ezra, or whoever he was, stood silently by the hearth, watching the fire burn. Mary, pale with exhaustion, asked him gently, "Do you remember the grave, sweetheart?" He nodded slowly, and then, with a voice that was neither child nor boy, he said, "Now he sleeps right." He blinked once, slowly, then walked away. In the days that followed, Ezra became even more detached. He no longer answered to either name. He began walking in circles, drawing spirals in the dirt, muttering about the roots and the echoing below. At night, he sat at the foot of Mary's bed and simply stared, unmoving, for hours. Not blinking, not speaking, just watching. And then just as suddenly as it had begun, he went silent. He stopped speaking altogether. He no longer looked at his mother, his father, or anyone else. It was as if the child inside had finally disappeared, leaving only a shell behind. The town doctor declared it a psychological break, childhood catatonia, he called it. The reverend claimed it was a spiritual debt being paid. The old folk had their own word for it, shadow swapped. That was the last winter Ezra lived at home. By spring, Mary and Thomas quietly arranged for him to be placed in the care of a small, church-run home for children with difficult afflictions. They packed his few things, a Bible, a wooden toy horse, and a photograph of the twins taken before Elijah died. Ezra never said goodbye, and as the carriage pulled away, Mary Delaney stood on the porch clutching her apron, knowing deep down that she had buried more than one son that year. She had buried the truth, and that truth had clawed its way back up. Zran never spoke again. Not a word, not a whisper. After that final utterance, "Now he sleeps right," he fell into a silence that lasted the rest of his life. No one could coax him to speak. Not Mary, not the church elders, not even the kind sisters at the evergreen home where he was eventually sent. Whatever lived inside the boy, called Ezra, had vanished or been replaced. When he reached adulthood, Ezra requested to return to Wolfe County. He took a job no one else wanted, groundskeeper at the very church that overlooked Elijah's grave. Day after day, year after year, he maintained the graveyard with meticulous devotion. He trimmed weeds, repaired fences, replaced rotted crosses, and kept the chapel windows spotless. But it was the nights that unnerved the townspeople most. More than one passerby claimed to see Ezra kneeling before Elijah's grave in the moonlight, his lips moving in soundless conversation. Others swore they saw two shadows flickering between the trees, one bent and older, the other much smaller, still childlike. Dogs howled whenever they passed by. Even crows avoided the trees surrounding the church. He never married, never moved away, never left a note or letter behind. He simply existed like a ghost in his own life. The Delaney family line ended with him. Mary Delaney, heartbroken and hollow, died in 1852, clutching a piece of yellowed paper in her hands. It was a child's drawing, two boys standing side by side. But one of the figures had been smudged black with ash, as if to erase or conceal it. No one knew which twin it was meant to represent. Thomas Delaney died just 2 years after her. His obituary made no mention of children. The pain had become too heavy to carry forward. The Delaney graveyard still stands to this day. Tucked behind the remains of the old chapel, now mostly collapsed and overgrown, the cemetery is rarely visited. But the twins' headstones remain side by side, weathered but unbroken. Time and nature have tried to reclaim them, but their markers have resisted. Nothing grows between the stones. No moss, no flowers, just dirt. Cold, packed dirt. Local legend warns travelers not to visit at night. Some say you can hear soft breathing near the graves if you listen closely. Others claim the wind seems to speak names, sometimes Ezra, sometimes Elijah, and sometimes both. To this day, no historian, doctor, or paranormal investigator has ever been able to explain what happened between Ezra and Elijah Delaney. The case defies categorization. Was it madness? Was it grief? Was it supernatural? Science has no answer. Faith remains silent. But the townsfolk of Wolfe County don't argue the details anymore. They know better than to ask too many questions. And they certainly don't speak the twins' names after dark. Because if the Delaney story teaches us anything, it's this. Some graves never stay closed. And some bonds, even in death, refuse to be broken.